Well, support for Ukraine is also expected to be a major topic during a visit by German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to Washington later. Talks between Chancellor Scholz and US President Joe Biden will focus on Russia's invasion and concerns that China's planning to provide Russia with military assistance. Mr. Scholz last visited the White House shortly before Russia invaded Ukraine. The US is about to announce a new $400 million military aid package for Kyiv.
I'm delighted to have...
Well, ahead of his trip to Washington, Chancellor Scholz addressed the German parliament and emphasised his long-term commitment to Ukraine. His speech came a year after his government implemented one of the biggest policy reversals in decades.
It's been 1 year since German Chancellor Olaf Scholz announced a turning point for Germany's defence and foreign policy. Over the course of that year, Germany has upped investments in its own military, unwound its economic ties with Russia, and broken its taboos over sending weapons into conflict zones. Taking stock a year after that pivotal speech, Scholz made clear Germany will continue supporting Ukraine's defense.
Wanting peace does not mean submitting to a bigger neighbor. If Ukraine stopped defending itself, it would not be peace, but the end of Ukraine.
Supporting Ukraine with weapons is something that, according to a recent poll, 47% of Germans view as appropriate. 16% say it does not go far enough. 1/3 of Germans say it goes too far. In his speech, Scholz found clear words of condemnation for Russia's president.
The question remains, is Putin even ready to negotiate a return to these principles and a just peace? Nothing suggests it at the moment.
The majority of Germans tend to agree that Ukraine must decide for itself when to engage in negotiations with Russia. 1 year into Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine and Germany's turnaround on defense and foreign policy, Germans generally support their government's stance towards Ukraine. However, this does not generally extend to the work of their government. Over half of Germans say they're less or not at all satisfied with it.
Well, I spoke to our political correspondent, Julia Saudelli, and asked her to tell me more about that third of Germans who are against sending weapons to Ukraine.
Well, Germany has quite a tradition within its society of movements against weapons deliveries, but also against, for example, American nuclear weapons being stored on German territory. And this is something that comes from Germany's history. It comes from the role that a divided Germany played during the Cold War. But we see some of these movements and some of these ideas still present in German society. For example, this past weekend, there was a demonstration in Berlin. About 15,000 people took part, calling for the end of weapon supplies to Ukraine, calling for a negotiated peace with Russia. And part of this movement are people who have legitimate concerns that sending more weapons to Ukraine might cause an escalation of the war, might cause the war to expand to other countries. But parts of these movements are also in some way still supporting Putin's Russia. Parts of the movement are also influenced still by Russian propaganda. There is quite a different set of people calling to stop sending weapons to Ukraine. But we must keep in mind 2/3 of Germans do support sending weapons to support Ukraine. And that is a number that we've seen slightly increasing, and that is also maybe surprising looking at Germany's history.
Right, thanks. Let's look ahead then to Chancellor Scholz's meeting with Joe Biden in Washington today. Unusually, there are no journalists travelling with Mr. Scholz. What's behind that?
Yeah, that is indeed unusual, and Scholz has been criticized for that, and also been criticized, for example, by the leader of the opposition for there not really being a clear reason for Scholz to suddenly be traveling to Washington. Now, Scholz's spokesman has said that this is simply a quick working trip, and that Olaf Scholz really wants to make good use of the whole time there. That's why the press is not traveling with them. But there are some hints that there may be some issues that the two leaders have to try to smooth out. For example, looking at tank deliveries, there is some inconsistencies as to looking at whether the US decided to deliver Abrams tanks only because in that case, if it hadn't, Germany would not have delivered Leopard tanks. There is some tension there, but also looking at China and looking at the US's Inflation Reduction Act, there are some issues where there might really be something that needs to be smoothed out.